Hello and welcome to this video in which we do an introduction to the Ruy Lopez opening, also known as the Spanish opening. We'll be giving an overview of all the main lines so that you're able to get started playing it. Okay, so here we go. White starts with pawn to e4, black plays pawn to e5. We respond with a natural move attacking their pawn. They reply with a natural move of their own, defending the pawn. So to enter the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish, we play bishop to b5, attacking their knight, which is defending the pawn. Black has a couple of options here. We're going to start by going through the main ones, and then we'll sort of rewind to go into some of the sidelines. So the most common move is pawn to a6, which maybe initially looks a little bit strange, as you might have thought that the main purpose of playing the bishop to b5 was to capture the knight so that we could then safely capture the pawn. This is a line. This is called the exchange Ruy Lopez. But it turns out it's not actually quite as simple as just winning a pawn, because black has a nice move of attacking both our knight and our pawn. So in fact, we can't just win the pawn this way. If we were to go for this line this way, it would be a little bit bad for white, because we've given up our bishop for a knight and the position is relatively open. So black is happy so far. They do have doubled pawns, but the doubled pawns also allow the bishop to come out very quickly. So normally if one goes for the exchange, they actually won't capture on e5 immediately. They'll do something else like castle. So normally most common is play the bishop back to a4. This is by far the main line. And now black usually will play their knight to f6. Now, we will typically castle. Knight to f6 is attacking the pawn. It is a line for black to play. We'll look at that in a little bit. But it's a little bit dangerous for black to capture this pawn, because we'll move our rook to e1, where the rook will all of a sudden be lined up with the king. So taking the pawn is somewhat risky for white to do. If you're worried about that, instead of castling, you can play your pawn to d3. This is a perfectly good line. I would recommend this to somebody also if they wanted to cut back on the amount of theory that they had to play. Many of the ideas that we'll see would still be applicable, but you won't have quite as many moves that you simply have to memorize. So in this video, we'll look at castling as the main move. And now that we have castled, we're actually still not quite threatening to take the knight and then the pawn, but we're getting closer. So black here has a couple of options. We're going to start with bishop to e7. We will play our rook to e1, defending the pawn. Now that we're defending our own pawn, it is actually a threat that we have to take the knight. Then after they recapture, then we take their pawn, and we will be up a pawn. So if, let's say, black plays a move like castling here, we can in fact take the pawn. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight over there. Black has a little bit of compensation because they have a bishop pair and the position is still open, but we are a pawn, so we're pretty happy about this. You will see occasionally people forget to make the move that they have to make here, which is pawn to b5, stopping us from taking their knight. We retreat our bishop to b3. Now there's a little bit of a split of moves that black has. The most common move is to play d6, which goes into the closed Spanish. They also can play castle, which has an option to go into the martial attack, a very dangerous attack for black. We're going to start with pawn to d6. And here, it's important to see that having played the pawn to d6, they're defending their e5 pawn. And so now they have a threat of playing knight to a5, which will trap our bishop. It's a trade, it's a knight for a bishop, but generally speaking in the Ruy Lopez, this bishop is a very, very important piece. If we think about the pawn structure that black has, all of their pawns are lined up on dark squares. And so that means that our bishop that is playing on a light square is actually quite happy. Now, if we lose that bishop, then they're going to be in good control of both of our bishops in a sense, because their pawns on dark squares are already pretty well lined up with our dark colored bishop. So generally speaking, we do not want to give up either of our bishops actually for a knight, but in particular we don't want to give up our light colored bishop. So now that they are threatening to move their knight to a5, we will make a little escape for our bishop by playing pawn to c3. If they had done this idea a move earlier, before playing their pawn to d6, we could now take this pawn. So they would get our bishop, but the bishop is not worth a whole pawn in this sort of situation. So that's why they first defend it. Now they're threatening to trap our bishop. We move our pawn to c3. And the most common move that they would have is castle. Now, the move that we want to play is pawn to d4 so that we can set up a big center this way. However, pawn to d4 doesn't quite work out right now. I think giving it a dubious mark like I have is perhaps a little bit harsh, as it can be a little bit interesting, this move. But black has a nice response that they move their bishop to g4, pinning our knight. And because the knight is pinned, it means that there's actually a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn. The idea for black, in fact, an immediate threat that they have, is to capture our knight after we recapture with the queen, which is the only way to avoid having our pawn structure damaged. Then they will have enough pieces attacking the d4 pawn that they can win this pawn. So this would be a little bit bad for us. Here too, you might wonder, well, what if they played the bishop to g4 one move earlier? The difference is that we have not committed our pawn to d3 yet. We haven't committed our pawn to d4 yet. So we can play pawn to d3. And now the bishop over here, it looks kind of nice because there's a pin here, but in fact it's not really doing anything. And one idea that we have is that eventually we can in fact completely sideline this bishop here. Looks like it's developed. It is developed, but it's not really developed to that great of a square because it's just hitting this pawn. So this is why we do things in the order that we do. So they will typically castle, and we play h3, because if we played d4 too soon, bishop g4 would come. And here we have a fork in the road. There are generally three possible approaches that black will take. There is the Breyer variation, there is the Chigorin variation, and there is the Zaitsev variation. We'll look at those one by one and go through all of the different ideas. We'll start with the Breyer variation. The Breyer variation looks very surprising if you've never seen it before, because what black does is they undevelop their knight by moving it to b8. Looks strange because why would you move the knight out and then back? But it turns out actually the knight on c6 is not really very well placed, because one of the key ideas for black is to try to move their pawn to c5. Now, this is designed as a way to fight our center, since our plan is to move our pawn to d4. And the knight on c6 is just getting in the way of pawn to c5. In fact, the two most common moves for black here are to move their knight to b8 or to move their knight to a5, either way to get out of the way of the pawn. So they move their knight to b8, and this is in fact a very good move. Historically, when people first started seeing this move, it's very counterintuitive, and especially in the era before computers, where you couldn't have a computer give you essentially the truth of the position, this was a move that really caught people off guard. We will continue with our plan by moving our pawn to d4, and they will play their knight to d7 as a way to support the e5 pawn. Now, one of the ideas in the Spanish is often to develop this knight all the way to f5, and this is what we're going to start this route now. So we move our knight to d2. Black will usually play their bishop to b7. This is a good trap to be aware of. Now, black's plan is to move their bishop to b7 and their rook to e8. If they do it in the wrong order, they'll actually just lose. So pay attention to the order your opponent's doing things in. If they play their rook to e8, this is a good puzzle. Pause the video for a moment if you want to try to solve it. We can, in fact, take on f7, and this just wins the game immediately. The king is forced to capture the bishop. Now we play knight g5 check. King goes back to g8. And now we have a funny move. We move our knight to e6, and look at that queen. It is completely surrounded by their own pieces, and so she's just trapped, and so the game is more or less over because we will have won a queen for 2 minor pieces. So sort of a funny move order problem that black has. So what they should do is move their bishop to b7, and what we want to do is move our knight to f1. However, if we were to do that straight away, it would be bad because we'd lose the e4 pawn. So we start by defending it with bishop to c2. And now black will play their rook to e8. We move our knight to f1, continuing its journey. They move their bishop to f8, and we move our knight to g3. This is protecting the pawn. Note that if we didn't make that move, black does have a threat here that they will capture our d4 pawn. We capture it back, and then they will have 3 pieces that are all attacking our e4 pawn. We would only have 2 pieces defending it, and so we need to take care of this. So we play our knight to g3, protecting that pawn, and this is the starting position of the main line of the Breyer. We're already 14 moves in, and this is sort of where it's starting. So the idea in this position is that white has a very big pawn center. Black has all their pieces on pretty reasonable squares. They're probably going to fianchetto this other bishop, so they've sort of rerouted their bishop to the long diagonal, and this is where the game's direction will go, that white is trying to keep their space. Black doesn't really have any particularly problematic pieces, but they have less space, so there's a struggle. The next important line of the closed Spanish is if black plays their knight to a5 instead of to b8. So knight to a5 is the Chigorin variation, and this is what our idea of moving our pawn to c3 was, is that after they attack our bishop this way, we can retreat it to c2. What black is intending is to push their pawn to c5 as a way to try to fight for the d4 square. We still will play our pawn to d4, and in this position, usually black will play their queen to c7 as a way to develop. If they chose to capture right now, we're actually pretty happy about this because this means our knight can get to a good square on c3. So usually black will try to keep the tension between all these pawns that are here. So the tension, I guess, is occurring between the d4 pawn and the c5 pawn because they both can capture each other. If black ever takes it, though, then it means our knight gets to a good square. So usually they play queen c7 first. It's essentially a waiting move because it lets us have the move. We have to figure out what to do, and the most common move is actually to move our knight to d2, and now they capture. So they capture only once we've committed our knight to this slightly worse square. Now, the bad thing about the Chigorin for black is that they have this knight on a5, so they'll usually try to reroute it to back to the middle. And I think the most natural move in this position is not really a very good one, which would be to attack the knight, because it looks kind of natural. We're gaining space, we're fighting for some squares, but then they can play their knight to b4, and in order to keep this bishop somewhere, we might end up having to go back to b1 here. This is not really great because it's blocking in our rook, which is going to struggle to develop. If we look at the pieces here, blacks are much better placed than ours. And note that if we moved our bishop here to b3, in addition to hitting its own pawn, it's also allowing knight to d3, which is forking our rook and bishop. It would end up being a trade, but generally speaking in the Spanish, it is better to have the bishop pair. It's a sort of situation where even if the center is kind of closed right now, it will eventually usually open up at some point, and the bishops are going to be better in those cases. So we don't usually play d5. What we do is sort of an interesting trick if we haven't seen it. We will defend this pawn with our knight, and then black will usually try to go after this knight, and we move our bishop to defend the pawn again. Black attacks our knight, and then we go back. So we sort of did this thing where we went back and forth, but in the process, what happened was it let our bishop jump over the d2 knight. And this would be the starting position of the Chigorin variation. The final main line for black in the closed Spanish is for them to play their bishop to b7. This is known as the Zaitsev variation. It used to be very popular, and there's some famous matches between Kasparov and Karpov that were played in this variation. By playing their bishop to b7, it's a place that the bishop we saw, it went there in many of the other lines. It is potentially putting some pressure on the e4 pawn. We play our pawn to d4, and they will play their rook to e8. Now, the reason that this variation is not really that popular nowadays is that this move, in fact, offers a draw in an implicit way. The reason is that white can move their knight to g5. This is putting pressure on the f7 pawn, and the only move that black can do to defend it is to move their rook back. And so then white can move back, and then we have the exact same position. Black is not forced to go for the draw if they don't want. So you could have a game where players are sort of bluffing because nobody wants the draw. They could decide to move their knight back, for example, to b8 and transpose into the Breyer variation, and this would be fine for them. But it's a lot of work to learn the nuances of the Zaitsev from black's perspective if you're just going to be offering a draw anyway, and then going into the Breyer. So most players tend to just go straight for the Breyer or the Chigorin or whichever variation they're trying to go for, rather than going for the Zaitsev. If they do go for the Zaitsev and you don't want to draw, which is a correct mentality, we shouldn't just play a game of chess and then decide to take a draw 15 moves into the game where we didn't actually think the whole time because it was just a theory that we knew. Then after they play their rook to e8, you would develop sort of the normal way, play your knight to d2. Eventually, if we have the opportunity, we would try to reroute our knight to g3, but often we will not get that opportunity because black is faster to put pressure on our e4 pawn. So this means that the knight that is on d2 will actually be kind of tied down to the e4 pawn. Eventually, white will usually play their pawn to d5 in these lines and maybe pawn to a4 to try to start playing on the queen side. Having looked at the closed Spanish lines of the Chigorin, the Breyer, and the Zaitsev, we'll now pivot to something very different known as the Marshall attack. Despite the name Marshall attack, this is in fact an opening for black, which gives you an idea of how dangerous it can be. So we start out with the same set of moves: castle, bishop e7, rook goes to e1, threatening the pawn, pawn goes to b5, we move our bishop back, and now what we looked at previously was black pushing their pawn to d6. Here for the Marshall attack, black castles. Now it should be said that when one plays the Marshall attack, black is going to sacrifice a pawn for a big initiative. If you don't like playing that kind of position, which is not everybody's taste, some people prefer attacking themselves, you don't necessarily have to go for the Marshall attack. You can avoid it from white's perspective here by playing either pawn to a4 or pawn to h3. In these cases, the games that you get will more closely resemble the games that we got in the previous section. However, the positions are maybe marginally worse comparatively than they were in the previous section because white does want to try to play pawn to c3 and pawn to d4 to try to support their center. The most critical test of the Marshall Gambit is to play your pawn to c3. This is accepting the Marshall Gambit. Here, black can still transpose back into the lines that we looked at earlier by playing their pawn to d6, in which case, recall that we would play pawn to h3 as a way to prepare d4. So sometimes they might start with this order as a way to bluff because they want you to play one of the anti-Marshalls, like playing a4 or h3 on a move earlier, and then they argue that you've sort of played a slightly inferior version of the Spanish. If they go for the Marshall proper, then they'll play their pawn to d5 straight away. And first time I saw this, I thought this was just a blunder. I thought I was clever, that I was winning a pawn, I captured, they captured back, and then I took the pawn on e5, And I said, hey, I'm up a pawn. Okay, I guess I'm doing really well in the opening. But it turns out things are not nearly that simple. This is, in fact, an opening that's very risky for both sides. It's risky for black because they're down a pawn. If white manages to develop all of their pieces successfully, white will be up a pawn and they'll probably win. On the other hand, at the moment, white is struggling a little bit to develop their pieces. Also, their rook on e5 is kind of a little bit suspiciously placed because right now it's a bit of a target for black. So black will usually play their pawn to c6 as a way to defend their knight. We were threatening to take it after all. And we will have a choice here to play either the pawn to d3 or the pawn to d4. We have to develop our pieces somehow. And I think pawn to d4 is the most natural move, but I slightly prefer pawn to d3 because this leaves us the d4 square to be able to use at some point for one of our pieces. It also means that the e4 square is better supported by this pawn. So we have an idea, for example, to maybe play knight d2 and then knight e4. So you have a choice, both are okay. And the game will proceed somewhat similarly. Play our pawn to d3, they might attack our rook, we come back. Now they come out to h4, they're threatening to checkmate us, and so we are forced to play pawn to g3, and usually they'll play their queen to h3. And this is the starting position of the marshal. The best move for white, just to finish with white's move, is to play rook e4 with the idea of chasing the queen away. But this is essentially the trade-off that white is up a pawn. They're not that far behind in development, but they are somewhat behind in development because all of their pieces, even the developed bishop, they're all on the queen side. Meanwhile, black is attacking on the king side. So if you could pick up this bishop and move it over here to g2, white's doing super well. White should win the game as they're up a pawn. They don't really have any problems. But it's going to take a really long time to get that bishop over there. In fact, it's so long that it's not really something that's even worth kind of thinking about at this point. And so usually what white will have to do is slowly move their knight out, move their bishop out. Sometimes they can move their queen out to f3 and then to g2 as a way to sort of plug the holes that are created by having pushed their pawn to g3. Black, meanwhile, will try to do moves like pawn to f5, maybe sometimes pawn to g5, but usually it's going to be pawn to f5, pawn to f4, and they're just attacking. And so this game will kind of come down to who is more alert on some of the different tactical ideas. So this is a much more tactical or aggressive line than the closed Spanish lines that were more about strategy and making sure to put your pieces in the right places. So far we've seen the closed Spanish and we've seen the martial attack. The other plans, rewinding a little bit, can be to develop this bishop to a different square than the e7 square that we went to. And so one of the ideas for black is to play pawn to b5. We have to move to b3, and then they come out with their bishop to c5. This is known as the Archangelsk Variation of the Spanish, and it is a very natural place to move the bishop because they're going to play their pawn to d6 usually, and the bishop is outside the pawn chain, so it is a more aggressively placed piece. Every move has a trade-off. There are a couple of downsides to having deployed the bishop in this way, one of which is after they play their pawn to d6, if we imagine putting a bishop on g5, it's going to create a rather annoying pin. The bishop on e7 was blocking the pin from being a thing. Sometimes the bishop on c5 also will be a little bit of a target for us because our idea in general in the Spanish is we're playing pawn to c3 and then pawn to d4. Now when we do that, we're going to gain a tempo by attacking the bishop. So then this is what happens in this variation. In fact, this kind of idea of playing pawn to c3 and then pawn to d4, attacking the bishop, that's the strategy to follow in almost all the variations where black plays their bishop to c5 this way. They can do it a few moves earlier than we've seen here, in which case it's kind of a little bit of a dubious move a lot of the time. But our strategy is usually quite similar, that we're trying to go after that bishop. So usually in this case, the move that white will play is pawn to a4. Now this is now creating a threat of taking the b5 pawn, because black cannot capture back, since that means that their rook would be hanging. Usually they'll move their rook to b8, we play our pawn to c3, and this would be the starting position. Pawn to d6, pawn to d4, attacking the bishop, and like we said, after the bishop retreats, we can sort of go about the game normally. Another thing that black can do is, after we castle in the early on positions, they can in fact take this pawn on e4. Taking this pawn is somewhat dangerous, as mentioned before, but it is definitely an idea. This is known as the open variation of the Spanish. And the thing to do here is play your pawn to d4 to try to open the position. The risk that black has by taking this pawn so early is that their king is still in the center, and they have removed our pawn, which means after we play our rook to e1, we're going to have more pressure potentially along that open file. So we play our pawn to d4, black should attack our pawn, play our bishop to b3, only move that we have, and usually they'll play their pawn to d5 as a way to try to reinforce their knight. Now we capture on e5, and this would be the starting position of the open Spanish. So we've gotten our pawn back, so we didn't lose a pawn or anything out of the opening this way. They have a good knight on e4, but it also can sometimes be a little bit of a target for us. If we can force it to retreat, then we're pretty happy that we accomplished that. And this is known as the open variation of the Spanish. Usually what we'll do, we'll play our knight to d2, often play our rook to e1. We'll usually play our pawn to c3 at some point as a way to give our bishop a bit of a escape valve. And this is where we'd have a game from here. So that covers the main moves that occur after pawn to a6 on move 3. We definitely didn't cover every possible option. Black has numerous options. It's impossible to go into every different thing, but those are the main lines that they can play. The other key line that happens is knight to f6. This is known as the Berlin defense, or the Berlin variation. Berlin variation was famously employed by Kramnik in his match with Kasparov for the World Championship, and it often has a reputation for being very drawish. Now, I think at a lower level, this reputation isn't really so applicable, but what happens in the main line is we get to an endgame really fast, so it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. If you don't like this idea, and you don't want to play the Berlin endgame, there are options that you can take. For example, you can still play pawn to d3 here, and then you'll get a normal Spanish game. It will not have the insertion of a6 and bishop to a4, but the positions are quite similar. In fact, often they'll transpose if black does play pawn to a6 at a later point. Although, note that if they played it here, this would be a chance that, in fact, we could take this pawn because we have defended the e4 pawn. The main line of the Berlin goes castle, just like how we ignored the threat of them taking our pawn before, and with our bishop on a4, we're going to ignore it now as well. They take our pawn, and similarly to what we saw previously, we play our pawn to d4. And here's the difference, though, between the Berlin versus the open variation. They now can play their knight to d6, which attacks our bishop. So they're gaining a tempo. If we were to, let's say, move our bishop, so we just retreated it to either a4 or we retreated it to e2, the problem we would have is that black can take our pawn on d4, for example, and they're up a pawn. They have managed to successfully take on e4, get their knight back. They're still a little bit behind in development, but it's not so far behind that we're going to be able to take advantage of it. Keep in mind, we haven't developed any of our queenside pieces either. So we're more or less forced to capture on c6. They will capture with the d pawn, and now we capture on e5. Get our pawn back. We're attacking the knight moves, and we trade queens. So black forfeits the right to castle because they moved their king. And this is the so-called Berlin endgame. The normal move for white is to play knight to c3, although there are some other options as well. And let's just assess the situation or the position a little bit. Black has forfeited the right to castle, so that's advantage for white. Black has doubled c pawns, so that's also an advantage for white, because if we were to trade all the pieces off, apart from the pawns, and we got to an endgame that had just king and pawns, white would be in very good shape, probably even winning, because white would be able to get a passed pawn by pushing pawn to f4 and pawn to f5 eventually, and then coming up with their king to support it. Black's pawns, where they have an extra pawn on the queen side, those pawns are somewhat crippled because of the fact that they're doubled. If you move this pawn over, wouldn't have this problem, but they have a 4-on-3 that they can't really make use out of. So in a pure endgame, white would be in great shape. Of course, we're a very long way from that pure ending. So those are the pros that white has. Black can't castle, and we have a normal pawn structure. The plus for black, so they can't castle, but they can argue that, well, that's not actually so bad because the queens are not on the board. There's not so much attacking chances for white because white is missing the biggest piece to take advantage of the fact that black cannot castle. And from a perspective of advantage, black has the 2 bishops. So they have 2 bishops. We only have 1 bishop because we have 2 knights instead. And this position is quite open. There's only 1 pawn in the middle. Our goal is eventually to try to push that pawn. As we start pushing the pawn, we start progressing with our pawn majority on the king side. That's going to only open things further for the bishops. So this is what the trade-off is in this endgame. This endgame can be analyzed in very long detail. This video is just meant to be an introduction to the Berlin, but generally there are a few plans for white. They could, for example, try to fianchetto this bishop to b2. Black has a choice of whether they will put their king, which does have to eventually get off the open file, whether to put it on e8 or c8. And usually what black will try to do is, since they have this potentially really good bishop on c8 because it's unopposed from us, they will try to put their pawns onto dark squares so that the c8 bishop becomes really, really good. Conversely, what we're going to try to do is we're going to somehow try to get our pawns activated. So this can be a little bit of a slow process, but our idea is that over time, we're going to improve our pieces a bit, one by one, and try to support our pawns so that they can advance. This ending has a very drawish reputation because at a top level, the players there are so good at endgames that they know how to hold very difficult positions. So it's positions that at an amateur level or even at a higher level than amateur level, but not at a super GM level, there are positions that are quite difficult to make a draw in. But if you play almost like a computer, you can. And so at a top level, this has a very drawish tendency. But this is not so applicable to lower levels. But what I've noticed is that there's not that many people that play the Berlin as black, I think because of this reputation of it being so drawish. So even though I don't think that that really applies to an amateur level, you won't see this that many times at a lower level because people at a lower level, they're playing to win. Like they're not going into their games as black just playing for a draw, the same way that a super GM who, if they're able to, in a super GM tournament, like the candidates, for example, if they draw all their black games and win all their white games, they'll almost certainly win the event. At a lower level, people aren't going in with that kind of mentality. They're really trying to win each game. And so they won't play the Berlin because they're thinking, oh, this is a drawish opening. I don't think they're really correct about that in the sense that I don't think it's that drawish at a lower level. However, it's true that this ending might not be to everybody's taste. If you're playing as black and trying to play for a win, it is a little bit counterintuitive to think, I'm just going to go to this endgame. But there's a lot of play in this endgame. There's a very big imbalance. So there is a chance for both sides to try to outplay the other side. The final line that we'll look at is a line that you won't see that often, but you do need to be prepared for it to come. And it's that black plays their pawn to f5. It looks like a very strange move at first because it is so weakening of the potentially castled king, but it is a aggressive attempt by black to try to take on white's center. There are a couple options that white can do. The most critical test would be to play their knight to c3. However, especially if you're just getting started with the Ruy Lopez, I wouldn't really recommend it because this isn't a variation that you're going to encounter that often. If you are encountering this variation, let's say 1 out of 100 games that you play the Spanish, you will see it once in a while, whereas your opponent, if they're playing this all the time as black, they're getting this position very, very frequently, and so they're likely to be more up to speed on what the theory is. They'll remember it, it'll be more on the top of their head. And so having a position that is more about understanding than it is about memorizing tends to be good. Of course, that same idea about having been more familiar with the position will be beneficial if it's about understanding things. But when it's understanding, at least you can learn the ideas and then you have them. Whereas if it's memorizing, it's something that you really need to keep drilling these ideas over and over again to actually remember it. So for this reason, I recommend pawn to d3 as a way to defend against their threat of taking our pawn. Now, usually they will capture, and we can assess this position a little bit. That if we look at development, we have 2 of our minor pieces out. Black has only 1, so that's slight plus for us. We can pretty easily develop all our pieces. We'll castle, we can play our knight to c3, we can develop our bishop maybe to g5, and importantly, when black castles, their king is going to be somewhat open on the diagonal that it's at. So we can imagine that we want to put a bishop there, and in fact that's usually what our plan will be. We also do have some pressure on the e5 pawn at the moment, because remember that the idea that black had as a way to defend it, going back to the third move, is that if we were to capture their knight, they would capture it back, and then if we took the pawn, they had this idea that they could play queen to d4, forking our knight and pawn. With the d line open this way, we actually do have a threat that we could take the knight, they take, and then we trade queens, they take our queen, and now in fact the e5 pawn would just be for taking. In fact, once we captured that, it would be even better for us because we'd also be threatening a fork. So this means that the e5 pawn is a little bit more at risk than it is normally. And so sometimes they'll just play d6 here as a way to defend that. Often they'll gambit the pawn. So they'll play something like knight f6 as a way to give up the pawn, but try to get their pieces very active. We castle. They play their bishop to c5, and now we take the pawn. Bishop takes. They'll usually capture with the b pawn so that we don't trade queens, because if we traded queens, we'd be up by a pawn. They wouldn't really have enough attacking chances to make up for it. We take their pawn, castle, and here we play knight c3, defend our own pawn, and we are up a pawn. Sort of similar to what we saw in a couple other variations, like the Marshal. They have a very open position. Their bishops are potentially very good, but we do have an extra pawn out of it. And so this is what this variation will go into. One final important variation is known as the Steintz Variation. There are a couple of places where the Steintz Variation can be played. The first one is dubious. The second one, though, is a completely legitimate move to make. So the Steintz Variation happens when black plays their pawn to d6. And it turns out that at this precise place, this is a little bit of a dubious move. It's a natural move because it's protecting the pawn on e5, and we said that in principle white was perhaps going to take on c6 and then take on e5, so black is just making sure that that never happens. But white can immediately play d4 here. And this tends to just put a lot of pressure on the black center. Black can play bishop to d7. We play knight to c3. And if they play their knight to f6, normal move, it turns out that here the center is somewhat under too much pressure. And so we can, in fact, take the c6 knight. Somewhat counterintuitive because we, generally speaking, do not want to give up our bishop for a knight. But now we actually do have enough pressure on their center. And so we typically would play something like queen e2, defend our own pawn because they do have some pressure there. And black will be forced now to capture our pawn on d4, at which point we take back, and now we have more space. So black has the bishop pair, but we have some extra space. Primarily, it's because of this d6 pawn, which is blocking in their own bishop. We're a little bit ahead in development also because our queen is out. Our minor piece is nicely placed in the center. We're perhaps threatening to just take their bishop pair immediately so that they don't even have that. And this is generally a good position for white. Because of this, the Steintz in this order is not really considered very good. Usually, people who play the Steintz will start by making the move a6, like we saw before, and only after we retreat our bishop, then they play d6. This is known as the Steintz Deferred. Now, here there's a very important trick not to fall for, which is if we make the same natural move that we made in the Steintz variation, that would be playing our pawn to d4. If we did that, black has a very good trick. They start with pawn to b5. We have really no choice except that we can retreat our bishop. Now they capture on d4. If we keep playing on autopilot, we take the knight. They take our knight. And here we have one last chance to maybe realize that something is wrong. But if we capture their pawn here, now we're actually dead lost. They play pawn to c5. This attacks our queen. The most aggressive place to move our queen to is queen to d5. And at first, maybe it looks like we're just winning because we're threatening checkmate and we're also threatening the rook. Problem is that black can defend both of these with one move of bishop e6. Now, their queen defends their rook, and their bishop got in the way of the checkmate. We could play queen to c6 if we wanted. Looks a little bit dangerous. They can't play queen d7 because we take the rook, but they drop back with the bishop. Now they come back to d5, and black, instead of repeating the position, they play c4, which now means the bishop is no longer in connection with f7, and in fact the bishop is just trapped and it's lost. And so black would be up a piece with really no significant problems of their own at this point. And so the game would effectively be over. And this entire sequence is not quite forced after pawn to d4, but after pawn to d4, white is more or less forced to sacrifice the d4 pawn if they don't want to get that position. So instead of playing pawn to d4, white can either castle or they can play pawn to c3 first. I think the simplest is to do pawn to c3 first with the idea to prepare d4. However, by doing it in this order, the very specific problem that happened with the regular Steintz Deferred of there being too much pressure on the e5 pawn too early, so that black was forced to play e takes d4, capturing. That problem doesn't happen. So essentially a way one can look at this is to say that the Steintz opening is a perfectly sound principle of trying to play their pawn to d6. However, there's a very specific problem that occurs that if white just opens the position up immediately, before black has had time to castle, for example, then white can get a good position. However, by doing it in this order, by inserting pawn to a6 and bishop to a4, it means that the logical move of pawn to d6, now it works tactically also, because white is forced to slow down a little bit before they open up the center by moving their pawn to c3. Of course, white is still in a good position. White still has a slight advantage, otherwise everybody would be playing this opening for black. But this is an opening to now take seriously. It could almost count as one of the closed Spanishes as well. I didn't put it in the section with Chigorin, Breyer, and Zaitsev, simply because the move orders come about in a different way. But it's related in the sense that the strategies are always quite similar. We'll see that white will play pawn to c3, pawn to d4, castle, usually try to have their knight take the Spanish journey to try to get all the way to f5. Okay, so that wraps up our introduction to the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish. We went on a pretty long journey of our own. Hopefully, after watching this video, you have some idea of the sorts of variations that you would encounter if you play this as white. The next step is really to start playing it, because there is quite a lot of theory. All the lines that we looked at, they go on much longer than we went into to do a proper video covering all of the ideas. We could certainly spend at least a half hour on each of the different lines that we looked at, and even then we wouldn't really go into as much depth as there is. The good thing though is that the Spanish is really a very good weapon for improving at chess. The concepts that we saw are very, very fundamental. When black responds to white's first move by playing their king pawn as well, they're creating a completely symmetrical position. Unlike the Sicilian, or the Carol or the French, or any of the other openings that black plays, where there's a built-in dynamic or asymmetrical aspect to things because they've done something different. In the Spanish, the first move is total symmetry. So what that means is that whoever's playing better is going to actually be winning. They're not having a worse position because of some different structure. Both sides are kind of trying to do the same thing. It just happens that one side will prevail in what they're doing. As white, you would have a little bit of an advantage since you went first. You have a bit more initiative in that battle. But all the ideas for black are often similar ideas that white will have, and vice versa. So, okay, so that wraps up everything. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up. If you have particular requests or questions about it, please feel free to ask in the comments. I can certainly make videos about some of the specific variations that we looked at, for example. But as mentioned, if I did it all in one video, I think the video would go on for 10 hours or something at least. So it would be better to tackle it one by one. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.